My name is Hannah Porter, and I'm 31 years old. The day I buried my husband, I came home a widow. I texted my family for a ride from the airport, but the message they sent back told me I wasn't just a widow, I was an orphan too. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. The air in the cabin was a recycled ghost, tasting of plastic and the faint, cloying scent of cheap coffee. For 14 hours, I had been breathing it in. Each inhale a reminder that I was trapped in this metal tube, suspended 30,000 feet above an ocean that felt as deep and indifferent as my own grief. I was suspended between two worlds, the one I had just left behind, where I stood on foreign soil and watched the coffin of my husband, Sergeant David Porter, get lowered into the earth, and the one I was hurtling toward, a home that now felt like a house, its rooms echoing with a silence I wasn't sure I could bear. The only thing that felt real, the only anchor in the disorienting fog, was the box on my lap. Inside was the American flag that had draped David's casket, folded by a Marine honor guard into a triangle so tight and perfect it seemed to hold all the order the world had lost. Its corners were sharp, digging into my thighs through the thin fabric of my black dress. I ran my thumb over the embroidered stars, the thick thread a rough comfort against my skin. I remembered the ceremony in excruciating detail, the crisp, formal movements of the soldiers, their faces impassive but their eyes holding a shared sorrow. I remembered the shocking, deafening crack of the 21-gun salute, a sound that seemed to splinter the sky itself. And I remembered the moment a young, impossibly composed Marine had knelt before me, his white gloves pristine, and held the folded flag out to me. On behalf of the President of the United States, the United States Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, he had recited, his voice low and steady, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your husband's honorable and faithful service. His words echoed in my head now, a hollow chant against the drone of the jet engines. Honorable and faithful service. David had been all of those things. He was the most honorable man I had ever known. He believed in service, in duty, in showing up for people. He had shown up for his country. He had always shown up for me. The irony was a bitter pill in the back of my throat. He had given everything, and now I was flying home from his funeral, utterly alone. The seat beside me was an empty, yawning chasm. I could almost feel the phantom weight of him there, see the shape of his hand resting on the armrest, his fingers laced through mine. We'd taken this flight together once, on our honeymoon, heading in the opposite direction. He had been giddy with excitement, pointing out constellations from the tiny window, his warmth a constant, reassuring presence beside me. Now, the cold from the window seeped into my bones, a deep, invasive chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. A flight attendant, a kind woman with tired eyes, paused by my row. She'd been gentle with me the whole flight, offering me water and tissues with a soft, pitying smile. "We'll be landing in about 30 minutes, honey," she whispered, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder for a brief second. "Is there anyone meeting you at the airport?" The question was a kindness, but it felt like a tiny dagger. "Yes," I lied, the word catching in my throat. "My family will be there." Hope is a stubborn, foolish thing. Even after a lifetime of evidence to the contrary, a small, stupid part of me believed that this time would be different. This tragedy was too big, too absolute, for them to treat with their usual casual neglect. This was the one time they would have to show up. My husband was dead. Surely that was enough to make them put down whatever they were doing for a single afternoon. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing our initial descent into the city. The seatbelt sign pinged on. Around me, the cabin came to life. People stretched, rustled through their bags, and turned on their phones. The air filled with a chorus of cheerful electronic chimes as a 14-hour message drought ended. A woman across the aisle laughed, her face bright as she read a text. "Oh, look," she said to her husband. "The kids decorated the whole house for our anniversary. They even got a banner that says, 'Welcome home.'" My stomach twisted. Welcome home. The words felt like a mockery. I was coming home to an empty house filled with David's things. His boots by the door, his coffee mug in the sink, his side of the bed cold and empty. The thought of walking into that silence alone was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. That's when I made the decision. I could call the military liaison officer. Captain Evans had been my rock through this whole nightmare, arranging everything with quiet efficiency. He had offered to have a car service waiting for me, but I had declined, insisting my family had it covered. My pride, another foolish, stubborn thing, had made me say it, but it was more than pride. I wanted it to be them. I needed just once to feel like I was their priority. I needed my mother's arms around me, even if they were stiff and awkward. I needed my father's quiet presence. I even needed my brother's lame jokes. I needed my family. My hands felt clumsy and cold as I pulled out my phone. I fumbled with the passcode, my thumb slipping twice before the screen lit up. I opened my messaging app and tapped on the group chat. Porter Crew. The name, chosen by my mom with a cheerful, oblivious exclamation point, felt like a relic from a different life. I scrolled up, a masochistic impulse I couldn't control. The last few weeks of messages painted a perfect picture of their lives that had continued, uninterrupted, while mine had shattered. There was a photo of my brother, Jason, standing proudly next to his new, ridiculously expensive grill. There were a dozen messages debating what to bring to a neighborhood potluck. My mother had shared a link to a sale at her favorite department store. My aunt had posted a picture of her cat. Nowhere in the thread was there a single, "Thinking of you, Hannah," or "We're so sorry," or "Let us know if you need anything." My husband's death had been acknowledged with a single, obligatory phone call from my mother, her voice tight with discomfort, before she quickly changed the subject to the weather. Still, I held on to that flicker of hope. I took a deep, shaky breath, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. This was it, the moment of truth. I typed out the simplest, most vulnerable sentence I could construct. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a demand. It was a question. Flight lands at 3 p.m. Can someone pick me up? I stared at the words. They looked so small on the screen, so fragile. I hit send. The blue message bubble appeared, and the word delivered materialized beneath it. My heart started to pound against my ribs, a frantic trapped bird. I watched the screen, unblinking, as if I could will the right response into existence. 1 minute passed. 2. The silence was deafening. The plane was descending through a thick bank of clouds, and the cabin grew darker. Then, the 3 little dots appeared next to Jason's name. He was typing. Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave. He's going to say yes. He's going to be there. Maybe he felt guilty for not being more supportive. Maybe this was his way of making it up to me. The dots vanished. His message popped. Up. We're busy. Try Uber. I read it once. Twice. A third time. The words didn't seem to make sense. It was like reading a foreign language. Busy. What could he possibly be doing that was more important than this? A meeting? A golf game? The grill he was so proud of? The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Try Uber. He might as well have said, "You're not our problem." The hope that had flickered in my chest was extinguished so fast it left behind the bitter smell of smoke. Before the full weight of his words could crush me, the 3 dots appeared again. This time, next to my mother's name. Okay, I thought. A desperate last-ditch plea to the universe. She'll fix this. She'll be horrified by what Jason said. She's my mother. She will come for me. Her message arrived, landing like a second blow before I had recovered from the first. Why didn't you plan better? It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. A needle-sharp dart of blame that went straight to the heart of all my insecurities. It was my fault. My husband's death, my grief, my return home. It was all a logistical failure on my part. I had failed to properly schedule my tragedy to fit their lives. This was a line she had used my whole life, a verbal tool to sandpaper down my needs, until they were small and smooth and easy to ignore. The time I'd gotten sick at school and she'd been annoyed she had to leave work. The time my first car broke down on the highway and she'd asked why I hadn't gotten the oil changed sooner. My pain was always, somehow, my own fault. I stared at the screen, at the 2 messages sitting there, one on top of the other. They were a matched set, a 1-2 punch of absolute indifference. The chat fell silent. No one else chimed in. My father didn't contradict them. My aunt didn't offer to come instead. The silence was their universal agreement. We're busy. You should have planned better. You're on your own. The plane broke through the clouds, and the gray, familiar skyline of my hometown came into view. I was almost home, but I had never, ever felt more lost. The flag in my lap was the only thing holding me together, a heavy, triangular anchor in a world that had just been swept away. The jolt of the plane's wheels hitting the tarmac was a brutal physical shock. It brought me back to my body, back to the stale air of the cabin and the imminent reality of walking out into a world that no longer contained my husband. Around me, the mundane symphony of arrival began. The clicks of seatbelts being unbuckled, the rustle of jackets being pulled from overhead bins, the cheerful cacophony of phones connecting to the network, each ping a tiny announcement of a connection being made, a loved one being reached. "Okay, we're here!" A man behind me boomed into his phone, his voice thick with the joy of homecoming. "I'm heading to baggage claim now. See you in 5." I remained perfectly still, a statue of grief in a river of motion. I held the box with the flag on my lap, my knuckles white. It was my shield, my armor against the onslaught of happy reunions I knew awaited me on the other side of the gate. I let the aisles empty, listening to the stream of friendly goodbyes and safe travel wishes fade away. A flight attendant gave me another sad, gentle smile as she passed. "Take your time, dear," she said softly. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, as if they hadn't held my weight in years. I slung my carry-on over my shoulder and walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the now empty cabin. Stepping onto the jet bridge felt like stepping onto a stage. The airport terminal, visible through the large windows, was a panorama of human connection. I saw a soldier in uniform drop to one knee to hug his 2 small children, who were screaming with delight. I saw an elderly woman's face light up as she was engulfed in a hug by a man who had to be her son. I saw a group of college-aged kids holding up a ridiculous hand-painted sign for their friend. Every scene of joy was a fresh stab of pain. Every laugh I heard felt like a personal insult. I was a ghost at a feast, invisible to the celebrants, my sorrow a language no one here could understand. I walked through the terminal, my gaze fixed on the floor, trying to avoid the images that were tearing me apart. But they were everywhere. A father bought his daughter an ice cream cone. A young couple was locked in a passionate kiss. Each one, a tiny, brutal reminder of the life that had been stolen from me, from David. And under the fresh, raw grief for my husband, an older, deeper wound was tearing open. The wound of my family. The cold finality of their text messages was not a singular event. It was the capital letter at the end of a long, cruel sentence that had been written my entire life. My mind, a traitorous archive, began to play the highlight reel of my own insignificance. The images flashed, sharp and vivid. I was 10 years old again, standing in our pastel-colored living room. It was my birthday party. My friends were there. There was a lopsided cake on the table and a pile of presents, wrapped in unicorn paper. But no one was looking at me. They were all gathered around my brother, Jason, who was 15 and too cool for everything. My parents had just surprised him with a brand new mountain bike. Not for his birthday, not for a special occasion, just because. "He's been working so hard at school," my father announced to the room, beaming with a pride I had never once seen directed at me. My mother joined in, ruffling Jason's hair. "We just wanted to get him a little something," she said with a laugh, as if a $500 bike was a casual trinket. My own party, my one day, had become the backdrop for celebrating him. I tried to show my mother the doll my best friend had given me, but she just patted my head absently. "That's nice, sweetie," she'd said, her eyes already back on Jason. "Now, don't be selfish. There's enough attention for everyone." It was a lie then, and it was a lie now. There was a finite amount of attention in our house, and it all flowed in one direction. The scene shifted. I was 16, sitting at the kitchen table, my hands trembling. A C+ on my American history midterm was on the table between my father and me. His face was a thundercloud of disappointment. "A C+, Hannah. This isn't like you. This is lazy," he'd said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're grounded for a month. No phone, no friends. Maybe that will teach you to take your future seriously." I had cried, trying to explain that I'd been struggling, that the teacher was hard, but he'd cut me off. No excuses. The punishment was swift and absolute. 1 week later, Jason, who had just gotten his license, took my dad's sedan, out without permission and wrapped it around a telephone pole. When I got home from school, I found my mother in the kitchen, fussing over Jason, dabbing at a small cut on his forehead. "Oh, my poor baby, are you okay?" she cooed. My father walked in, saw the wreckage of his car being towed, and just sighed. "Well, son," he'd said, clapping a hand on Jason's shoulder. "Boys will be boys. The important thing is you're not hurt. It's just a car." The hypocrisy was so blatant, so staggering, it had left me speechless. Jason's reckless, Dangerous mistake was a lesson learned. My academic slip-up was a moral failure requiring severe punishment. The final memory was the most painful. My wedding day. The entire time I was planning it, my mother had been a fountain of passive aggression. "Are you sure about this, Hannah?" she'd ask in hushed tones over the phone. "Marrying a soldier. It's such a transient life. We'll never get to see our grandchildren." It was never about my happiness. It was about her access, her convenience. The day of the wedding, the morning I was supposed to be filled with nothing but joy, I got a text from Jason. "Hey, so sorry. Can't make it. My buddy's parents offered me their lake house for the weekend and I just can't pass it up." "You get it. Rain check on celebrating. Have fun." I didn't get it. I didn't get it at all. I had stood there in my white dress, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, and cried. When my mother saw my tear-streaked face, she just sighed with irritation. "Oh, Hannah, don't be so dramatic. You know how your brother is. Don't let him ruin your big day." It was my job not to be hurt. My job to absorb the disappointment and carry on smiling. David had found me moments later, and when I told him what happened, the look on his face was one of cold fury. He'd wrapped his arms around me and whispered in my ear, "I'm sorry, hon. So sorry. But listen to me. I am your family now. I will always, always show up for you." His promise, the one thing I had clung to, now echoed in the vast emptiness of the airport terminal. He was the one person who had always shown up, and he was gone. I stood there, amidst the joyful chaos of strangers, and all the excuses I had made for my family my entire life crumbled into dust. They weren't busy. They weren't forgetful. They weren't just like that. It was a choice. They had actively chosen, again and again, to place my needs, my feelings, and my life at the very bottom of their list of priorities. My brother's new grill, my mother's shopping trip, my father's golf game, whatever triviality had filled their day was officially more important than their grieving daughter and widow coming home from burying her husband. The realization settled over me, cold and heavy as a burial shroud. It wasn't that they didn't love me enough, it was that they didn't love me at all, not in any way that mattered. To them, I was not a daughter or a sister. I was an orbiting satellite, distant and self-sufficient, whose occasional requests for entry into their atmosphere were a nuisance to be swatted away. And in this moment, the most desperate moment of my life, they had swatted me away for the final time. I stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, the river of travelers parting around me as if I were a rock. My phone was still in my hand, the screen glowing with their final damning words. A tremor of pure, white-hot rage shot through me. It was so intense it made my vision blur at the edges. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing out a torrent of pain and fury I had suppressed for decades. How could you? How could you be so heartless? I just buried my husband. I just sat for 14 hours with his flag on my lap and you can't even be bothered to drive to the airport. What is wrong with you? My thumb hovered over the send button. I could picture the fallout. My mother's tearful, defensive phone call, accusing me of being cruel and ungrateful. My brother's angry texts, calling me hysterical. My father's stony silence, his ultimate weapon of disapproval. They would twist it, as they always did, until I was the villain of the story. My outburst would become the problem, not their initial cruelty. It would be another piece of evidence in the case they'd been building my whole life. Hannah is too sensitive. Hannah is so dramatic. Hannah makes everything difficult. And then a wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like it could pull me to the floor washed over me. I was tired. I was tired of fighting for a scrap of their attention. I was tired of explaining my own humanity to them. I was tired of auditioning for the role of daughter, a role I had clearly never been cast in. Arguing with them would be like screaming at a brick wall. The only person who would end up hoarse and hurting was me. Silence. Silence was the one thing they couldn't twist. It was the one language they didn't know how to argue with. It was an absence, a void. And in that moment, I realized it was the only power I had left. My thumb moved from the send button to the backspace key. I deleted the entire paragraph, letter by letter, until the text box was empty again. The rage receded, replaced by a strange and lucid calm. This wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic retreat from a war I could never win. I was laying down my arms not in defeat, but in liberation. I took a deep, steadying breath and typed 2 words. No worries. I stared at them. They looked pathetic and small, but they felt like the heaviest words I had ever written. They were a lie, of course, but they were also a vow. I will no longer worry you with my needs. I will no longer worry about your approval. I will no longer worry about being a good enough daughter. It was a period at the end of a long, painful chapter. I hit send. The blue bubble appeared on the screen, and I felt a cord inside me snap. A cord that had tethered me to them, that had me constantly looking back for a sign of love that was never going to come. I closed the messaging app. Then I turned my phone off completely and slipped it into my purse. I didn't want to see if they replied. It didn't matter anymore. I turned my back on the massive, blinking sign for baggage claim. My suitcases, filled with my black funeral clothes and the few mementos of David I'd brought with me, could circle on that carousel forever. Nothing in them was essential. I started walking with no destination in mind, just a powerful, instinctual urge to move forward. I walked past the rental car counters, past the crowded coffee shops, past the USO lounge with its sign welcoming military personnel. I saw a young man in fatigues inside, laughing on the phone with his family, and I felt a pang of envy so sharp it almost buckled my knees. But I kept walking. I was heading for the main exit, toward the sliding glass doors that led to the passenger pickup curb. I had no idea what I was going to do when I got there. Maybe I would just sit on a bench and wait for the numbness to consume me. Maybe I would eventually turn my phone back on and call the Uber my brother had so helpfully suggested. I was walking into a complete unknown, a future that was a terrifying, empty void. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the city air hit me. It was autumn, and the air was crisp and cold, smelling of rain and exhaust fumes. It was a shock to my system after the recycled atmosphere of the plane, and it felt like the first real thing I had experienced all day. I stopped just outside the doors, my eyes adjusting to the gray afternoon light, and that's when I saw it. A pristine black SUV was parked directly in front of the doors, in a zone clearly marked, no parking. Its hazard lights were blinking, in a slow, steady, patient rhythm. As I stood there wondering if it was security or some VIP vehicle, the doors opened in perfect, silent unison. 3 men stepped out. They were immaculate. They were all wearing the Marine Corps dress blue uniform, a stunning vision of dark blue, white, and gold. The fabric of their jackets was perfectly pressed. Their white trousers had a crease so sharp it looked like it could cut glass, and their black shoes were polished to a mirror shine. They moved with a synchronized, purposeful grace that made everyone else on the sidewalk seem clumsy and chaotic. They were an island of order and dignity in the frantic mess of the airport. The oldest of the 3, a master gunnery sergeant with silver hair at his temples and a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite, took 2 steps forward. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, found mine across the 20 feet that separated us. They held a universe of understanding. He didn't rush toward me. He just stood there, waiting, giving me a moment to process. The 2 Marines flanking him were younger, one probably not much older than 20, but they stood with the same immovable stillness, their gazes respectful but watchful, forming a protective barrier around me without taking another step. I felt the entire world slow down. The noise of the traffic, the shouting of the taxi dispatchers, the rumbling of the airport shuttles, it all seemed to fade into a muted background hum. People walking by slowed their pace, their eyes drawn to the silent, powerful tableau unfolding on the curb. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. As I closed the distance, the master gunnery sergeant looked from my face down to the box. In my arms, acknowledging the flag, acknowledging my husband. Then he looked back at me. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't speak. He simply brought his white-gloved hand up to the brim of his hat in a slow, deliberate, breathtakingly perfect salute. The other 2 Marines mirrored the action instantly, and that's when I broke. The tears I had held back on the plane, the ones I had choked down after reading the texts, the ones I had refused to shed in the terminal, they came all at once. A silent, hot, unstoppable flood. They weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of release, a release of the crushing weight of my family's neglect, of the profound loneliness, of the grief I had been carrying all by myself. In that single, silent gesture, these men, these strangers bound to my husband by a code of honor, I was only just beginning to understand, had told me everything I needed to hear. They had told me that David's life mattered, that my loss was seen, that my sacrifice as his wife was honored, that I was not alone. The family that shared my blood had dismissed me with 6 careless words in a text message. The family David had chosen, his brothers in arms, had shown up for me in their most formal attire, with the highest gesture of respect their tradition allowed. They hadn't just come to pick me up, they had come to rescue me. From the outside, the scene must have been intensely cinematic. The gray, impersonal backdrop of the international airport terminal, the chaotic flow of travelers with their overstuffed suitcases and crying children. And then, at the center of it all, this pocket of profound stillness. A lone woman in a simple black dress, her face streaked with tears but her posture upright, clutching a wooden box containing a perfectly folded flag. Before her, 3 men who looked as if they had stepped out of a history book, their dress blue uniforms a stark, stunning contrast to the casual sloppiness of modern travel. Their salutes were held, unwavering, a silent testament to something sacred in a profoundly profane world. We didn't know we were being watched, not really, but in the age of omnipresent cameras, a moment of such raw visual power could not go unnoticed. A local news crew, there on a mind-numbingly dull assignment to get a soundbite from a visiting city councilman, was packing up their gear. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, was probably thinking about traffic and what to get for dinner. Her cameraman, a veteran with an eye for human drama, was panning his camera across the curb one last time when he saw us. "Whoa. Sarah, look at that," he would have said, his voice low. I can picture her turning, her bored expression melting away, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of a journalist who knows they've stumbled upon a real story. Not a manufactured photo op, but a moment of authentic, unscripted human experience. She would have told him to start rolling immediately. The camera would have zoomed in, the lens finding my face, then the solemn faces of the Marines, then the flag in my arms. It captured the silent tears rolling down my cheeks and the unwavering respect in the eyes of the men before me. After a moment that stretched into what felt like a lifetime, the master gunnery sergeant lowered his salute and stepped forward. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble, but it was incredibly gentle. "Mrs. Porter," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Frank Miller, it is our honor to escort you." He didn't ask if I was ready. He didn't ask where I was going. He stated it as a fact. One of the younger Marines, a corporal with kind eyes, stepped forward and gently took my carry-on bag from my shoulder. The other opened the rear door of the black SUV. They moved around me with a quiet, unobtrusive efficiency that was profoundly comforting. They were taking charge, lifting the impossible weight of simple logistics from my shoulders. Just as I was about to get into the vehicle, I saw the reporter, Sarah, approaching cautiously from the side. Her cameraman stayed back, keeping a respectful distance. She didn't shove a microphone in my face. Her expression was one of genuine empathy. "Ma'am," she began, her voice soft, "I'm so sorry for your loss. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I don't want to intrude, but that was an incredible sight. Would you be willing to say anything at all?" My throat felt like it was sealed with cement. I couldn't have spoken if I'd wanted to. I was still reeling from the emotional whiplash of the last hour, from the depths of my family's betrayal to this unexpected, overwhelming display of honor. I shook my head, unable to form words, but as I did, a sudden clear impulse cut through my grief-stricken fog. I needed to say something, but not with my voice. I owed it to these men, to David, to mark this moment. I shifted the flag box to hold it in the crook of one arm and fumbled in my purse. My fingers closed around a pen and a crumpled receipt from the airport bookstore in Germany. Using the hard surface of the flag box as a makeshift desk, I uncapped the pen. My hand was shaking, but my writing was clear. I didn't have to think about the words. They were already there, fully formed in my mind. I wrote one sentence. I folded the small piece of paper and held it out to the reporter. She took it from my hand, her eyes filled with a compassionate curiosity. I gave her a small, tight nod, a silent thank you for her respectful approach. Then I turned and got into the back of the SUV. The ride to my house was silent, but it wasn't the cold, empty silence of the group chat. It was a silence filled with shared understanding and profound respect. Master Gunnery Sergeant Miller drove. With a steady, confident hand, I stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of my city pass by in a blur. The landmarks of a life I had shared with David were everywhere. The park where he'd proposed, the restaurant where we'd had our first date, the bridge we used to run across together. Each one was a fresh wound, but for the first time, I didn't feel like I was bleeding out alone. The presence of these 3 silent, stoic men was a tourniquet for my soul. That evening, the story aired on the 6 o'clock news. In my parents' pristine suburban living room, the television was probably on, providing its usual background hum to their quiet, orderly lives. My mother would have been there, perhaps with her customary glass of Chardonnay, scrolling through, something on her tablet. My father would have been in his armchair, reading the paper. They might have been having a bland conversation about property taxes, or complaining about a neighbor's unkempt lawn. Then, the news anchor's serious face would have filled the screen. And we end our broadcast tonight with a story that is both heartbreaking and inspiring, he would have begun. The screen would cut to the footage from the airport. I can see my mother looking up, her brow furrowed in mild interest. "George, look," she might have said to my father. "That's the airport." Then the camera would zoom in on my face. I can imagine the flicker of recognition in her eyes, followed by confusion, and then a dawning horror. Her daughter. The news. My father would have lowered his paper, his expression hardening. The anchor's voiceover would have been solemn and damning. Hannah Porter, the widow of Sergeant David Porter, who was recently killed in action, returned home from his burial overseas today. The footage of the Marines saluting would play, powerful and undeniable. While her family was reportedly unable to meet her, the anchor continued, and I can feel the weight of those words as they landed in that quiet living room. Members of her late husband's Marine unit made sure she did not have to arrive home alone. The broadcast would have cut to the reporter, Sarah Jenkins. "Hannah was understandably too emotional to speak," she would say, her face earnest and compassionate. But as she was being escorted to the vehicle, she passed me this small, handwritten note. And then the camera would have pushed in on a close-up of the crumpled receipt, my handwriting clear and stark against the printed text. My mother would have leaned forward, squinting at the screen, and read the words aloud, her voice a choked, disbelieving whisper. "Family is not who leaves you at the gate. It's who shows up anyway." The story would end. The broadcast would cut to a commercial for a smiling family eating yogurt. But in my parents' living room, there would have been a different sound. The sharp, violent, explosive sound of a crystal wine glass shattering on the hardwood floor. It would have been the sound of their private, casual cruelty being held up for the entire world to see. The sound of their perfect, curated image being irrevocably broken. I was at home, in the suffocatingly quiet house that still smelled like David's aftershave, when my phone started to buzz. I had turned it back on out of a grim sense of necessity, knowing there were official calls I'd have to take, paperwork I'd need to handle. The Marines had walked me to my door, done a quick, professional sweep of the house to make sure everything was secure, and left with a final, solemn nod. "Call this number if you need anything, ma'am," Master Gunnery Sergeant Miller had said, pressing a card into my hand. "Anything at all, day or night." The silence they left behind was absolute. I stood in the entryway, my carry-on bag, at my feet, the flag box clutched to my chest, and felt the full weight of the emptiness. This was it. This was my life now. Then came the first buzz from my phone on the kitchen counter, then another, and another. Soon, it was buzzing and pinging nonstop, a frantic, insistent alarm. My first thought was that it was my family, an explosion of angry texts, of furious voicemails. My stomach clenched in anticipation of the onslaught. With a deep, steadying breath, I walked over and picked it up. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications, but they weren't from my mother or Jason. They were from Facebook, from Instagram, from news apps. A friend from college had sent me a link. The message above it just said, "Hannah, wow, you are so strong." With trembling fingers, I tapped the link. It took me to the news station's website, and there I was, a photo of me, tear-streaked and pale, looking up at the 3 stoic Marines was the top story. The headline read, "A hero's widow, a silent salute, and the note that broke a city's heart." I watched the video clip, my heart pounding. It was surreal, like watching a movie about someone else. I saw the scene as the world now saw it, not through the filter of my own pain, but as a raw, powerful story of honor and abandonment. I saw my own strength reflected back at me, a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Then I made the mistake of scrolling down to the comments section. It was a flood, thousands of comments, pouring in from all over the country. This is what the Marine Corps Brotherhood is all about. Semper Fi. God bless this widow and shame on her so-called family. I'm a grown man and I'm sitting here crying. Her quiet dignity is astounding. That family of hers doesn't deserve her. As a Gold Star wife myself, I felt this in my soul. Sometimes the military is more of a family than your own blood. Sending all my love and strength to Mrs. Porter. On. And on it went. An avalanche of support, of compassion, of righteous anger on my behalf, all from total strangers. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and in a strange way, incredibly validating. For my entire life, my family's narrative had been the only one that mattered. Their version of me, the difficult, overly emotional, independent one who never needed anything, was the official story. Now, in the space of a 2-minute news segment, that story had been obliterated. The world didn't see me as a burden. They saw me as a woman of substance and grace. They saw my family for what they were, callously cruel. The public shaming must have hit my mother like a physical blow. Her carefully curated world of suburban perfection, of garden club meetings and charity luncheons, had been invaded by an ugly, undeniable truth, and her reaction was perfectly, predictably her. It wasn't to call me and beg for forgiveness. It wasn't to rush over to my house and hold me. It was to engage in frantic, desperate public relations. A notification popped up on my phone. Your mother tagged you in a post on Facebook. My blood ran cold. I clicked on it. There it was. A photo from a family vacation to the Grand Canyon 5 years earlier. We were all there, squinting in the sun, our smiles painfully forced. Jason had his arm slung around my shoulder, in a gesture that looked brotherly, but was really just him using me to steady himself on the rocky ledge. My mother had added a long, syrupy caption. "Family always comes first," she wrote. "In difficult times, we have to hold each other close. We are so incredibly proud of our strong, brave daughter, Hannah, as she navigates this impossibly tragic time. Our hearts are broken for her, and with her. We are always here for her, no matter what." The hypocrisy was so audacious it left me breathless. Always here for her. The words seemed to mock me from the screen. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to her friends, to her community, to the faceless mob of strangers on the internet. This was a performance of motherhood, a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative, but the public wasn't buying it. The comment section under her post became a digital courtroom, and she was being prosecuted. Always here for her? The top comment read with over 1,000 likes. "I guess here doesn't include the airport. I saw the news. You should be ashamed of yourself." Someone else had posted a direct link to the news story. For anyone confused by this post, here's what family always comes first actually looks like for the Porters. Her friend's initial polite comments, "Thinking of you all," were soon buried under an avalanche of condemnation from strangers. Her desperate attempt at damage control had backfired spectacularly, dousing the fire with a barrel of gasoline. That's when my brother finally made contact. He tried calling first. I saw his name flash on the screen, and a cold dread filled me. I silenced the call, my hand shaking. He immediately tried again. I silenced it again. A moment later, a voicemail notification appeared, followed by a text. I listened to the voicemail first. His voice was tight with anger, not remorse. "Hannah, pick up the phone. What the hell is going on? Mom is hysterical. You've got all these crazy people attacking her online. You need to call that news station or post something to fix this. You're embarrassing the whole family. Embarrassing the family. Not, 'I'm so sorry I hurt you.' Not, 'I made a terrible mistake.' It was all about how my pain had inconvenienced them, how my public validation had become their public shame." Then I read his text. It was even worse. "That thing on the news was crazy. Didn't realize it was that serious. You should have said something." I stared at the words, and a sound I didn't recognize clawed its way out of my throat. It was a laugh, but it was brittle and harsh and utterly devoid of humor. "You should have said something." The ultimate gaslighting. My husband's death wasn't serious enough. My request for a ride wasn't clear enough. It was my job to signal the depth of my despair in a way that was convenient for him to recognize. My grief had an unspoken etiquette, and I had failed to observe it. The old Hannah, the people-pleasing, conflict-averse Hannah would have felt a pang of guilt. She would have wondered if maybe he was right. She would have texted back an apology, but that Hannah had died somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. I thought about all the years I had swallowed my hurt, all the times I had apologized just to keep the peace. I thought about the thousands of tiny cuts that had led to this one deep, gaping wound, and I knew I was done. I was done explaining. I was done begging. I was done being their emotional shock absorber. My fingers moved over the keyboard. I didn't type out my anger. I didn't type out my pain. I typed out a boundary, a conclusion, a simple statement of fact. You made your choice. I looked at the words, so stark and final. It felt right. It felt true. I added one more line. So did I. I hit send. There was no triumphant feeling, no rush of vindictive pleasure. There was only a profound, quiet, and deeply peaceful sense of release. It was the sound of a chain, long rusted and heavy, finally breaking. I put my phone down on the counter, face down. I walked into the living room, the flag box held tight against my chest, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, terrifyingly, and beautifully free. The days that followed my brother's final, blame-shifting text were a strange blur of silence and noise. The silence was in my house, a heavy, profound quiet, where David's laughter used to be. The noise was from the outside world, a relentless digital cascade of opinions and emotions from strangers. My story had become public property, a modern-day parable shared in a million different ways. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life, watching as people dissected and debated my most painful moments. I kept my phone on silent, venturing online only to delete the dozens of friend requests from people I didn't know and to block the inevitable trolls. My only goal was to survive the hours, to make it from sunrise to sunset without shattering into a million pieces. I had no interest in fanning the flames. I wanted it all to go away. I wanted to retreat into the quiet shell of my grief and be left alone. So when the first email from a producer at a national morning show arrived, I deleted it without a second thought. I did the same with the one from a popular podcast and the one from a syndicated radio host. They all wanted the same thing, an oasis, exclusive. They wanted to put my pain under their bright, hot studio lights. I wanted no part of it. But then an email appeared in my inbox that was different. The sender was Sarah Jenkins, the reporter from the airport. The subject line was simply, "Thinking of you." Her email wasn't a pitch. It was a letter from a human being. She didn't talk about ratings or exclusives. She wrote about how the moment at the airport had stayed with her, how she had been moved by the quiet dignity of the Marines and by my strength. She told me that the story had clearly touched a nerve across the country and that people felt a powerful connection to what I was going through. "I know the last thing you probably want right now is more attention," she wrote. "But I also see what's happening. People are telling their own stories in the comments sections, stories of being let down by the people who were supposed to love them most. You've given a voice to something many people feel, but never say aloud. If you ever feel you want to use that voice in a more direct way, on your own terms, I would be honored to help you do that. No pressure, no deadlines. The offer is here if you want it, and if not, I just wanted you to know I'm thinking of you and wishing you peace." I read her email 3 times. Her words, "on your own terms," echoed in my mind. My whole life had been lived on someone else's terms. My parents' expectations, my brother's needs, the military's schedule. My story had been told about me, but I had not yet told it myself. I still felt the instinct to hide, to protect what little privacy I had left. But Sarah was right. Something bigger than my own pain was happening. By staying silent, I was letting everyone else define my experience. My deliberation went on for a week. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding with anxiety at the thought of facing a camera. The public's support was a warm blanket, but it could so easily turn. One wrong word, one emotional slip, and they could turn on me, calling me an attention seeker, an opportunist. It was safer to remain the silent, dignified widow from the news clip. But then I'd think of the messages I'd received before I'd silenced my phone. The ones from other widows, from lonely veterans, from people estranged from their families. A woman whose parents had refused to attend her same-sex wedding. A man whose father had kicked him out for choosing to be an artist instead of a lawyer. Our circumstances were different, but the core wound was the same. The pain of being rejected for who you are by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. My story wasn't just my story. The turning point came on a Tuesday. I was looking at a photograph on the mantelpiece, my favorite one of David. He was in his civilian clothes, a goofy grin on his face, his arms slung around my shoulders. He looked so happy, so full of life. David was never afraid to speak up for what he believed in. He was the bravest person I knew, not just on the battlefield, but in life. He would never have hidden from a chance to speak the truth. I looked at his smiling face and I asked him, my voice a whisper in the silent room. What do I do? And I knew the answer. I wrote back to Sarah Jenkins. I'm ready to talk. The day of the interview, I felt a strange, detached calm. The anxiety was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach, but it was overlaid with a sense of purpose. I chose my outfit with care, not the black dress of mourning, but a simple, dark blue blouse. It was the color of David's dress uniform, a quiet tribute to him. It felt like wearing a piece of his strength. In the car on the way to the studio, I didn't rehearse lines. I just focused on one simple idea: tell the truth. The studio was exactly as I'd imagined, a cold, dark space dominated by the unnatural heat and brightness of the lights. Cameras, like giant mechanical insects, loomed in the shadows. But Sarah's presence was a small island of warmth in the artificial environment. She greeted me with a gentle handshake, not a hug, respecting my space. She led me to a comfortable chair and assured me we could stop at any time. When the cameras started rolling, my heart began to pound. Sarah started gently. Hannah, thank you so much for being here. Can you take us back to that day at the airport? What were you feeling as you stepped off that plane after such an unimaginable loss? My voice, when I first spoke, was thin and shaky. I just felt numb, I began, my eyes fixed on Sarah, and very, very tired. The world felt loud and out of focus. All I wanted was a quiet car ride home. I just wanted to see a familiar face. You reached out to your family, Sarah prompted softly, and their response has been seen around the world. It must have been incredibly painful. It was, I said, the knot in my stomach tightening. It was painful, but it wasn't surprising. It was just the loudest version of a message I'd been hearing my whole life. Sarah leaned forward, her expression full of genuine curiosity. You also wrote a note that day, a note that has become a rallying cry for so many. It said, "Family is not who leaves you at the gate. It's who shows up anyway." What was going through your mind when you wrote that? This was the moment, the reason I had come. I took a deep breath, and I looked away from Sarah, directly into the dark, unblinking lens of the main camera. I wasn't talking to a journalist anymore. I was talking to everyone who had ever felt like they were on the outside looking in. I used to think family was a fact, I said, and my voice was different now. It was steady. It was clear. It was a biological reality. You were born into it, and you were stuck with it, for better or for worse. You were obligated to them, and they were obligated to you. That's what I was taught. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. But what I learned in that moment, standing on that curb, is that that's not true. An obligation is not love. A shared last name is not a guarantee of support or kindness. Blood is just biology. It doesn't entitle you to a person's heart. The Marines who met me that day, I continued, a surge of emotion making my voice thick. They had no obligation to me. I wasn't their blood, but they shared a bond with my husband, a bond forged in loyalty and honor and sacrifice. And they chose to extend that bond, that honor, to me. They didn't have to be there. It was probably inconvenient for them, but they showed up. They showed up when it was hard, and when it mattered most. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze intense. And that's what makes a family. It's not blood, it's presence. It's choosing to show up, again and again. It's the friend who holds your hand in the hospital waiting room. It's the neighbor who brings you food when you're sick. It's the soldiers who come to the airport to welcome home a fallen brother's wife. That's family. Family is a choice. It's a verb. It's the act of showing up. When I finished, the studio was silent. I could hear the faint hum of the lights. Sarah had tears in her eyes. Hannah Porter, she said, her voice a little choked. Thank you. I went home and turned off my phone. I didn't need to see the reaction. I had said what I needed to say. I had told my truth. And for the first time since David's death, I felt a glimmer of something that wasn't pain. It was a quiet, clean, and powerful sense of peace. I had taken my story back. In the wake of the interview, the world seemed to divide into two camps. There was the small, silent world of my biological family, a black hole from which no communication emerged. And then there was the rest of the world, which responded with a tidal wave of support that was both humbling and overwhelming. My story was no longer just a viral news clip. It was a national conversation. The phrase, "presence makes family," started appearing everywhere. A hashtag shared by thousands, a mantra for the lonely and the disconnected. I tried to keep my head down, to navigate the quiet, treacherous landscape of early grief. I sorted through David's things, each t-shirt and paperback novel a fresh torment. I learned to cook for one, the silence of the kitchen a constant, deafening companion. I was navigating my private sorrow while my public persona was taking on a life of its own. About a week after the interview, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. My instinct was to ignore it, but something made me answer. "Is this Hannah Porter?" A warm, gentle voice asked. "Yes, it is. My name is Maria Sanchez. Hannah, I'm a Gold Star wife. My husband, Captain Carlos Sanchez, was killed in Afghanistan 6 years ago." I sat down heavily on the edge of my unmade bed. "Oh," I said softly. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for you too," she replied, her voice filled with an empathy so genuine it brought tears to my eyes. "I'm calling because I, like so many others, was incredibly moved by your story, by your interview. You spoke a truth that many of us in the military community have lived, but have never been able to articulate so clearly." She paused, and I could hear her take a breath. "There are a lot of people here in the city, Hannah, who feel a connection to you and to Sergeant Porter. We want to do something, not for the cameras, not for the news, for you, for him. We want to hold a candlelight vigil at the city park to honor your husband's memory and to show you that you are not alone, that this community is here for you." My immediate reaction was a recoil, a vigil, more people, more eyes on me. It sounded like a nightmare. "Oh, Maria, that's so kind," I stammered. "But I'm not sure I'm up for that. I'm a very private person." "I know," she said gently. "Believe me, I know. This isn't about putting you on display. You wouldn't have to speak or do anything at all. Think of it less as something for you and more as something for us, for the community. You've given us a gift by sharing your story. You've given us a chance to connect. Please," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "let us show up for you, Hannah." Her using my own words back to me was a masterstroke. It disarmed me completely. How could I champion the idea of showing up and then refuse the first real offer from my new burgeoning community? It was a test of my own newfound conviction. "Okay, Maria," I said, my voice barely audible. "Okay." The night of the vigil was cold and clear. As Maria drove me to the park, my hands were clenched in my lap, my anxiety a frantic hummingbird in my chest. I was terrified, but as we pulled up, my fear was eclipsed by awe. The park's great lawn was transformed. It was a sea of soft, flickering lights. Hundreds of people, maybe more than 1,000, were standing in the cold, their faces illuminated by the small electric candles they held. They were people of all ages, all races, all walks of life. I saw families with small children, elderly couples leaning on each other for support, groups of teenagers, and a large, stoic contingent of veterans in their VFW hats. At the edge of the crowd, I saw a familiar sight: Master Gunnery Sergeant Miller and the 2 young Marines from the airport. They had come, of course. They always showed up. Maria led me to the front, where a small space had been cleared. People nodded at me respectfully as I passed, their eyes full of a quiet, compassionate understanding. There was no pity, only solidarity. Local pastor said a brief, beautiful prayer. Maria spoke, her voice clear and strong, about the unseen sacrifices made by military families. She spoke of the empty chairs at dinner tables, the holidays spent alone, the constant fear and the quiet pride. And then she spoke about David, sharing details she had learned from me in our phone calls. His love for bad action movies, his skill at making pancakes, his infectious laugh. She made him real for them, not just a symbol, but a man who was loved and is now missed. They didn't ask me to speak. They had promised to protect me, and they did. Instead, a young girl, probably no older than 16, stepped forward with an acoustic guitar. She looked terrified, her eyes wide as she looked out at the sea of faces. Hi, she stammered into the microphone. "My name is Chloe. I didn't know Sergeant Porter, but my dad is active duty Air Force, and Mrs. Porter's story, it really meant a lot to me. So, this is for Sergeant Porter, and for Mrs. Porter, and for everyone who's ever felt alone." She took a shaky breath and began to play. Her voice, when she started to sing, was shockingly beautiful. It was clear and pure, an angel's voice cutting through the cold night air. She sang a soft, heartbreakingly slow version of Fields of Gold. The world seemed to fall away. It was just me and that girl's voice, and the 1,000 points of light held by strangers. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart crumbled. The tears I thought I had no more of began to flow, silent and hot, down my cold cheeks. But for the first time, I wasn't crying alone. I was crying in a forest of light, held up by the quiet, powerful presence of a community that had chosen to be my family. The girl's song was a simple, profound gesture of love from a complete stranger, and it was more real, more meaningful than anything I had ever received from my own blood. As the last notes of the song faded into a reverent silence, I instinctively glanced towards the edges of the crowd, towards the deep shadows beyond the candlelight. And that's when I saw him. He was standing behind a massive oak tree, half hidden, as if he was afraid of the light, but I knew him instantly. It was Jason, my brother. He was alone, his shoulders slumped in his expensive jacket. The arrogant smirk he always wore was gone, replaced by a look of utter desolation. He was watching me, his face a pale mask of what looked like shame, or confusion, or maybe both. He was an outsider here, a tourist in a land of genuine emotion. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second across the field of light. In that moment, I saw the chasm that had opened between us. It was no longer just a disagreement or a misunderstanding. It was a fundamental difference in the way we moved through the world. I was surrounded by a family of strangers who had chosen to show up. He was utterly alone, an architect of his own isolation. He didn't approach. He couldn't. The wall of light, of community, of shared honor, was invisible but impenetrable. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if in defeat, and then he turned and melted back into the darkness from which he came. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a deep, aching sadness for what we had lost, and a profound, overwhelming gratitude for what I had found. The weeks following the vigil were a turning point. The media attention began to fade. The torrent of messages slowed to a trickle, and I was left in the quiet of my home, in the quiet of my new reality. The community had shown up for me in a spectacular way, but the days were still long and filled. With the mundane, painful tasks of a life cleaved in two, I was grateful, but I was also adrift. My grief was a vast, uncharted ocean, and I was in a lifeboat with no land in sight. I needed a purpose. I needed a direction. The idea began as a whisper, a persistent thought that would surface in the dead of night. It was born from the endless loop of my own arrival, the coldness of the texts, the warmth of the salute. I kept thinking about that stark contrast, and I kept thinking about the stories people had shared with me, the messages from other service members and spouses who had experienced their own lonely homecomings. An Air Force mechanic whose wife had emptied their bank account and left him while he was on a 7-month deployment, returning to an empty apartment and an eviction notice. A female Army captain, a decorated combat medic, who returned from a brutal tour to find her parents had moved to a retirement community in another state and hadn't thought to tell her. My story was not unique. It was just the one that had been caught on camera. The whisper grew into a conversation. I called Maria Sanchez. I told her about the stories, about the feeling of uselessness that was gnawing at me. All this support is wonderful, I told her, pacing my living room floor. But what do we do with it? What happens tomorrow when the next soldier comes home to an empty gate? What are you suggesting, Hannah? She asked, her voice already full of the practical energy I had come to admire. I'm suggesting we become the people we needed, I said, the idea finally taking shape as I spoke the words aloud. We create a network, a group of volunteers in every major city, a team of people who will be on call to make sure that no service member ever has to step off a plane to an empty airport again. We'll meet them, we'll drive them home, we'll buy them their first meal. We'll be the welcome they deserve. There was a moment of silence on the line, and then Maria laughed, a sound of pure delight. Hannah Porter, she said. That's the best idea I've heard in a decade. But what do we call it? I looked at the mantelpiece, at the framed photo of the news clip from that first day, the one showing the 3 Marines standing guard. They were like sentinels. We'll call it the Gatekeepers Project, I said. The project consumed me. It was the best kind of therapy. It took my pain, my anger, my grief, and gave it a productive outlet. My kitchen table, once the site of so many lonely meals, became my command center. It was covered in laptops, legal pads, and endless cups of coffee. Maria became my partner, my co-founder, her pragmatism and experience perfectly complementing my passion. We roped in Master Gunnery Sergeant Miller as an advisor, his knowledge of the military world proving invaluable. Even Sarah Jenkins, the reporter, helped us, using her media savvy to help us craft a mission statement and build a simple, powerful website. We spent months building the foundation, filing for nonprofit status, creating a database for volunteers, establishing contacts at military bases and VFW posts across the country. It was exhausting, tedious, and the most fulfilling work I had ever done. This was my quiet revenge. It wasn't about tearing my family down. I had no energy left for that. It was about building something beautiful and strong in the space they had left vacant. It was a constructive act of defiance. Our first official welcome home was for a 19-year-old Marine corporal named Ben Jensen. He was returning from his first deployment, a difficult tour in a place his family couldn't find on a map. They lived in a small town in rural Oregon and simply couldn't afford the cross-country flight to meet him at JFK in New York. He was expecting to land, navigate the bewildering maze of the city's transit system, and take a bus to his base, all alone. I flew to New York myself for that first mission. I didn't want to leave it to chance. I met our small, newly formed JFK chapter, a gruff but kind-hearted retired Army sergeant named Sal, a bright-eyed college student named Maya who was volunteering in honor of her grandfather, and another military spouse, a quiet woman named Kim. Standing in the International Arrivals Hall at JFK, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It was the same chaotic energy, the same anticipation, the same families holding signs. But this time, I was on the other side. I was the one waiting. I was the one ready to show up. We held a large, simple, handmade sign. It read, "Welcome home, Corporal Jensen. We've got you." We waited for nearly an hour. Finally, we saw him. He was just a kid, with a face too young for the weary, haunted look in his eyes. He walked through the gate, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and he looked lost, overwhelmed by the noise and the crowd. He scanned the faces, his expression hopeful at first, then slowly falling as he realized no one was there for him. That was our cue. Sal and I walked forward. "Corporal Jensen?" I asked gently. He looked at me, confused. Then his eyes found the sign Maya and Kim were holding. He read the words, and his face crumpled. The tough, professional mask of a United States Marine dissolved, and he was just a boy, thousands of miles from home, who had been holding it all together for too long. His eyes filled with tears. I don't understand," he stammered, his voice thick. "I'm Hannah Porter," I said, offering a small smile. "And this is the Gatekeepers Project. We're your ride. Welcome home." The look of profound, staggering relief that washed over his face is a memory I will carry with me forever. We didn't just give him a ride. We took him to a classic New York diner and bought him the biggest, greasiest cheeseburger on the menu. We let him talk, not about the horrors of combat, but about his hometown, his dog, his dream of becoming a mechanic. We just listened. We were his family for those few hours. Maya took a picture on her phone, a candid shot of Corporal Jensen sitting in the diner booth, wiping a tear from his eye as he looked at our sign, which was propped up on the seat next to him. That night, I posted the photo on the Gatekeepers Project's new Facebook page. The caption was simple. "This is what showing up looks like. Welcome home, Ben. We've got you." By the time I woke up the next morning, it had exploded. The photo was everywhere. It was even more powerful than my own story because it wasn't about a problem. It was about a solution. It was hopeful. The project became a national phenomenon overnight. Donations, small and large, flooded our website. Volunteer requests poured in from every state. My personal tragedy had given birth to a movement. In the middle of that whirlwind week, I was sorting through mail when I saw an incoming call on my phone. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, my heart a cold, still stone in my chest. I silenced the call and watched it go to voicemail. Later that night, driven by a morbid curiosity, I listened to the message. Her voice was thin and shaky, a voice I barely recognized. It was stripped of its usual crisp, confident authority. "Hannah, it's your mother," she began, her words hesitant. "I saw on the news, the project, the gatekeepers. It's a wonderful thing you're doing. Truly wonderful." She paused and I heard a shaky inhale. I know I haven't called. I didn't know what to say. That day, at the airport, I didn't know how to help. I didn't think you'd want us there. It was the same hollow excuse, the same deflection. I didn't know. I didn't think. It was still about her feelings, her comfort, her inability to step outside of herself. It was the ghost of an apology, a transparent attempt to absolve herself, without ever having to say the words, "I'm sorry, I was wrong." The old Hannah would have seized on that tiny crumb of connection. She would have called back, desperate to believe it was a start. But the new Hannah heard the words for what they were, empty. I held my finger over the screen, over the icon of her message. There was no anger, no rage, no desire for revenge. There was just nothing. It was like looking at a letter addressed to a person who no longer lived at this address. With a quiet sense of peace, I pressed delete. A year can change everything. The Gatekeepers Project grew from a heartfelt idea, sketched out on a legal pad, into a robust, nationwide organization. We went from one chapter to 50, from a handful of volunteers to thousands. The photo of Corporal Jensen became our emblem, a symbol of our simple, powerful mission. I was no longer just Hannah Porter, the widow from the news. I was Hannah Porter, the founder and director of a respected nonprofit. I spent my days on conference calls, coordinating logistics, and my nights writing grant proposals. My grief hadn't disappeared. It had become a part of me, a quiet river that ran beneath the surface of my new purposeful life. But it no longer threatened to drown me. The media attention returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't focused on my personal tragedy, but on the hopeful work of the project. We were featured on morning shows and in newspaper articles. I became a reluctant but effective public speaker, sharing our mission at VFW conventions and military family conferences. I learned to tell my origin story without my voice shaking, framing it not as a tale of woe, but as the catalyst for something beautiful. The ultimate validation came in the form of a phone call from a journalist at the New York Times. They wanted to do a long-form feature for their Sunday magazine on me, the project, and the national conversation I had started about the meaning of family and community. The journalist, a thoughtful man named David Chen, spent weeks with me and my team. He came to a welcome home event at the Seattle-Tacoma airport, watching as our volunteers greeted a female soldier returning from her deployment in Africa. He interviewed Maria, Master Gunnery Sergeant Miller, and half a dozen service members our project had helped. He even interviewed Corporal Ben Jensen, who was now thriving at his new base and volunteering with our local chapter there. When the article finally came out, it was a work of art. The headline, splashed across the cover of the magazine, read, "The Gatekeeper: How Hannah Porter Turned a Private Betrayal into a National Movement of Belonging." The feature was 10 pages long, complete with beautiful, powerful photographs. It told the whole story, starting with that fateful day at the airport. It recounted, in the paper's trademark factual, dispassionate style, the text messages from my brother and mother. It didn't sensationalize them. It simply presented them as the inciting incident, the seed of neglect from which a forest of kindness had grown. The article framed my family's failure not as the main event, but as a footnote in a much larger, more inspiring story. I didn't know how or when they saw it, but I knew they would. I learned about the first ripple from an old high school friend, a woman I hadn't spoken to in years, who called me out of the blue. "Hannah, oh my God, the Times article," she gushed. "It's incredible. You're incredible. You know, it's so funny. I was at the country club for brunch on Sunday, and your parents were at the table next to mine. You should have seen it. Old Mrs. Gable from down the street went up to them, waving the magazine in her hand, and said, 'Martha, George, you must be the proudest parents in the world. I just read this amazing story about your Hannah.'" My friend laughed. "Hannah, their faces, they looked like they had swallowed lemons. Your mom just gave this tight little smile and said, 'Yes, we're very proud,' and then immediately changed the subject. It was the most awkward thing I have ever witnessed." I hung up the phone, a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. There was no joy in her story, no sense of victory. There was just a quiet, profound finality. Their punishment wasn't something I had designed or inflicted. It was simply the natural, unavoidable consequence of their choices. They were being forced to publicly affiliate themselves with a success story that was built on their own monumental failure. They had to smile and nod and accept the congratulations, all while knowing that everyone who read that article knew the truth. I heard about Jason from a cousin. He was at a corporate retreat, and his boss, trying to make conversation, had mentioned the article. "Hey, Porter," he'd apparently said in front of a group of colleagues. "Is that amazing woman in the New York Times? The one who started that Gatekeepers thing? Any relation to you?" Jason, the golden child, the one who had always been the center of the family's universe, was now reduced to a supporting character in my story. His identity, in the eyes of the world, was now permanently fused to his worst, most selfish moment. The brother who had told his grieving sister to try Uber. This was the poetic justice. My revenge was my success. My revenge was my happiness. My revenge was the community that had risen up to support me. My family hadn't been cast out or condemned by me. They had simply been rendered irrelevant. They had built their world around their own comfort and convenience, a world too small to contain real love or sacrifice. And so they were trapped in it, forced to watch from the cheap seats as my life became bigger, richer, and more meaningful than they could have ever imagined. They hadn't been pushed out of my life. They had simply failed to keep up. They had faded into the background, not because I had erased them, but because they had become too small to see. It's a Tuesday afternoon, a little over 2 years since I stepped off that plane from Germany. I'm at an airport again, but this time, everything is different. I'm not here to travel or to welcome someone home myself. I'm standing on an observation balcony, leaning against the railing, just watching the river of humanity flow through the arrivals hall below. My gaze lands on a small group of people gathered near Gate C12. They're a motley crew, a retired couple, a young man in a university sweatshirt, a woman with a baby strapped to her chest. They're holding up a familiar sign, one I've seen hundreds of times now, but it still makes my heart swell. Welcome home, Sergeant Davis. We've got you. They're a Gatekeepers team, a chapter I've never personally met. They organized this welcome all on their own. I watch as a young woman in uniform, looking exhausted but relieved, walks through the doors. She sees the sign, and a slow, beautiful smile spreads across her face. The volunteers don't mob her. They just open their circle and welcome her in. The young man takes her bags, and the retired woman hands her a bottle of water. They are strangers, bound together by a simple choice to show up. My legacy is alive and breathing right in front of me, and it has nothing to do with me anymore. It's self-sustaining. It's real. For a long time after David died, I thought I needed an apology from my family. I would lie awake at night, playing out imaginary conversations where they would finally see the pain they caused, where they would weep and beg for my forgiveness. I was waiting for a phone call, a letter, a knock on the door that would somehow fix the broken parts of me. But the real healing began when I stopped waiting for them to fill the void and started building something in that empty space myself. What I had perceived as a giant gaping hole in my life wasn't a hole at all. It was an opportunity. It was a blank canvas. It was the open space I needed to build a new kind of family, a better kind, one based not on the obligations of blood, but on the voluntary, beautiful, and sacred act of presence. I thought I needed them to change. I didn't. I needed to change. I had to become what they weren't. I had to become the one who shows up. And now, as I look down at this sea of strangers, this community we built, this family we chose, I know with a certainty that settles deep in my bones that I will never be alone at the gate again. What would you have done if your family abandoned you at the gate? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories prove that silence is the loudest answer, and action is the only apology that matters.